They sang about heartache, hope, and the beauty of a simple life. Their voices echoed through dusty honky-tonks, AM radios, and the Grand Ole Opry stage. They were once country royalty, men whose music helped shape the soul of America. But behind the cowboy boots and rhinestone jackets, behind the fame and gold records, lies a haunting truth. Some of the greatest legends in country music didn't just fade away. They died broke, forgotten, and alone. This isn't the story of chart-topping success or glittering awards. This is the story of 15 old country music stars who died in poverty. Some were betrayed by the very industry they helped build. Others made choices they couldn't undo. And one story in particular is so heartbreaking, it might stay with you long after this video ends. These were men who gave the world their music, and in return, the world gave them silence when they needed it most. So saddle up, because today, we're not just remembering their songs. We're uncovering the final, often tragic chapters of their lives. Great. Let's begin with artist number 1 in our tragic journey through forgotten legends. 1. Lefty Friselle, the voice that died with empty pockets. Long before George Strait or Merle Haggard ever picked up a guitar, Lefty Friselle was the king of smooth, emotional country crooning. With hits like If You've Got the Money, I've Got the Time, and I Love You a Thousand Ways, Lefty revolutionized vocal phrasing in country music. Everyone who came after him, from Willie Nelson to Randy Travis, borrowed from his style. But the man who taught Nashville how to sing never learned how to protect what he earned. In the 1950s, Lefty was riding high. He had multiple #1 hits, was selling out shows, and was hailed as the future of the genre. But his success came at a price. He was notoriously bad with money. Lavish spending, constant touring expenses, and a tangled web of bad business deals drained his fortune faster than it could come in. Worse, he never took care of publishing rights, a fatal mistake in an industry where royalties could have saved him. Alcohol crept into his life like a shadow. In the 60s, Lefty's career began to stall. He struggled with addiction, and the big hits stopped coming. By the time he reached his 40s, he was broke, overweight, and depressed. His phone stopped ringing. His friends stopped calling. In 1975, at just 47 years old, Lefty Friselle died of a massive stroke. When the coroner looked into his financials, they were stunned. The man once worth millions died nearly penniless. There was no mansion, no trust fund, no vault of royalties. Just faded records and a voice etched into vinyl. His funeral was modest. Few in the mainstream media covered his death. Nashville had moved on. But here's the thing. Without Lefty, there would be no George Jones, no Alan Jackson, no Keith Whitley. He shaped them all. Yet his final years were spent in obscurity, watching the genre he helped define pass him by. Faren Young, the hillbilly heartthrob who died in silence. At his peak, Faren Young was everywhere. Known as the singing sheriff, he was one of the biggest stars of the 1950s and 60s. Hits like Hello Walls, written by Willie Nelson, and Live Fast, Love Hard, Die Young turned him into a household name. He was charming, rebellious, and electric on stage, a symbol of country cool before it even had a name. But behind that charm was a man haunted by demons. Faren was notorious for his short temper and volatile relationships, both personal and professional. He drank heavily, he alienated bandmates, he clashed with record labels. As newer acts came onto the scene in the 1980s and 90s, the industry that once worshipped him began to forget he existed. His music was no longer played on the radio, his calls went unanswered, his bookings dried up. But perhaps the most bitter twist in his story? He was one of the original founders of Music City News, a publication that could have made him wealthy for life, but he sold his stake early for just $2,000. The paper went on to thrive for decades without him. By the mid-1990s, Faren was depressed, broke, and angry at a world that had moved on. He felt abandoned by country radio, abandoned by his fans, and abandoned by Nashville itself. He said in one interview, "They won't even play my music on the radio. They act like I never existed." In December 1996, Faren Young took a .38 caliber pistol and shot himself in the head at his Nashville home. He lingered in the hospital for 2 days before passing. He was 64. His suicide note reportedly blamed country radio for erasing him. And sadly, it wasn't entirely wrong. The man who once defined the honky-tonk spirit died feeling invisible and irrelevant. Faren's death sent ripples through the music community, but by then, many fans had already forgotten his name. Another voice silenced too soon. Another legacy lost in the noise of a changing industry. 3. Johnny Paycheck, from Take This Job and Shove It to A Life in Ruins. If ever there was a country star who embodied rebellion, it was Johnny Paycheck. With his rough-edged voice and defiant attitude, he captured the frustrations of the working class in songs like Take This Job and Shove It. For a time in the 1970s, he was riding high. Platinum records, sold-out tours, and the adoration of every outlaw-loving country fan in America. But Johnny Paycheck lived the outlaw life a little too hard. He tangled with the law repeatedly. There were charges for assault, drug possession, tax evasion, you name it. He burned bridges across the industry. And like many stars of his era, he spent money faster than he made it, pouring it into drugs, booze, and flashy living. The real turning point came in 1985, when Johnny got into an argument at a bar in Ohio and shot a man in the head. The man survived, but Johnny was sentenced to 7 years in prison for attempted murder. He served nearly 2 years before being pardoned by Ohio's governor. By the time he got out, country music had moved on without him. The hits stopped. The radio went silent. He played tiny venues just to keep food on the table. And when illness came, diabetes, emphysema, and more, he couldn't afford the medical care he desperately needed. By the early 2000s, Johnny Paycheck was living in a nursing home, unable to pay his bills. His wife and fans did what they could, but the money was gone. The royalties he should have had were tied up in legal battles and bad contracts. When he died in 2003 at the age of 64, he was buried in a donated plot at Nashville's Woodlawn Memorial Park with a modest headstone. George Jones reportedly paid for the funeral expenses. This was the man who once stood shoulder to shoulder with Merle Haggard and Waylon Jennings, now remembered by many only for his one big hit and a laundry list of legal troubles. His was a life of grit, glory, and tragedy, a classic country song come to life, only with a final verse far more somber than any chart-topping hit could prepare us for. 4. Boxcar Willie, the smiling drifter, who ran out of track. You couldn't miss Boxcar Willie in his prime. With his scruffy hat, gap-toothed grin, and old-timey rail yard charm, he became a symbol of classic feel-good country. Songs like Train Medley and Wabash Cannonball weren't just nostalgic. They were electrifying to the blue-collar fans who felt forgotten by Nashville's glitzier new direction. Boxcar didn't start his music career until he was in his 40s. Before that, he was a U.S. Air Force flight engineer, flying over oceans with a guitar in his lap. When he finally hit the stage full-time, he brought a lifetime of hard-earned stories with him. In the 80s and 90s, he became a regular on Hee Haw, the Grand Ole Opry, and various syndicated shows. He even bought his own theater in Branson, Missouri, long before it became a retirement destination for country stars. For a brief moment, Boxcar Willie was not just a novelty. He was a sensation. But fame is fleeting. As Branson became overcrowded with bigger acts and flashier productions, Boxcar's theater struggled to stay afloat. Behind the scenes, his finances were stretched thin. The overhead, maintenance costs, and staff salaries consumed his profits. When his health started to fail, the show couldn't go on, but the bills never stopped. In the late 90s, Boxcar was diagnosed with leukemia. He kept performing as long as he could, but his body gave out. He died in 1999 at the age of 67. Despite his years of entertaining millions, his family revealed that very little was left behind. The dream had faded, and the money with it. His theater eventually closed. His music stopped playing on the air. And yet, in small towns across America, people still remember the man who made them smile with songs about trains and freedom. Boxcar Willie died a humble man. But perhaps the most heartbreaking truth is that he also died a forgotten one, with his financial legacy buried under years of debt and quiet misfortune. 5. Mel Street, the voice of pain that no one could save. There was something hauntingly honest about Mel Street's voice. He didn't just sing country music, he lived it. Every note of Borrowed Angel, Lovin' on Back Streets, and I Met a Friend of Yours Today was soaked in sorrow, heartbreak, and longing. In the early 1970s, he was hailed as the next George Jones, with a vocal delivery that felt like it was torn straight from his soul. But behind the studio magic and the cowboy stage presence, Mel Street was collapsing under the weight of unseen torment. From the outside, things looked promising. He was charting hits, appearing on TV, and building a loyal fan base who appreciated his traditional sound at a time when country was veering toward pop. But privately, Mel struggled with crippling depression. He battled alcohol dependency and felt increasingly isolated in an industry that demanded a smile even when your world was falling apart. Worse still, Mel's finances were in constant disarray. Mismanagement, small-time contracts, and lack of guidance meant that even as he rose on the charts, he was never financially secure. Despite his talents, he was barely scraping by, a cruel reality for a man whose songs sold thousands of copies. But the most devastating part of Mel Street's story is how it ended. On October 21st, 1978, his 45th birthday, Mel locked himself in the bathroom and took his own life with a handgun. Just hours before, he had appeared on a local television program, joking and performing as if nothing was wrong. There was no estate, no wealth, just a grieving family, stunned fans, and a legacy that would never reach the heights it deserved. Years later, fellow artists would say that Mel Street had one of the purest country voices they'd ever heard. But like too many others, his pain went unnoticed until it was too late. His music lives on in reissues and tribute albums, but the man himself, he died in near poverty, alone and in anguish. His story reminds us that even the brightest lights can flicker and go out far too soon, especially when no one is looking close enough to see them dim. Would you like me to continue with artist number 6? 6. David Houston, a number one voice forgotten by time. In 1966, David Houston shook the country music world with Almost Persuaded. The song wasn't just a hit, it was a phenomenon. It spent 9 weeks at number one on the Billboard Country Chart, won a Grammy, and made Houston a household name virtually overnight. And for a while, he was unstoppable. With a velvet voice and clean-cut image, Houston released a string of successful duets with Tammy Wynette and Barbara Mandrell. He became a staple of the Grand Ole Opry. He was respected, admired, and, in the words of many, destined for country royalty. But the industry is fickle, and David Houston's moment passed quicker than anyone expected. By the mid-1970s, new stars were dominating the scene. Outlaw country was taking over, and Houston's traditional style was suddenly labeled old-fashioned. His singles stopped charting, his record deals dried up, and without consistent hits or royalties, his income took a nosedive. Behind the scenes, David struggled with the reality of being yesterday's news. He still performed at state fairs and small venues, but the crowds were thinner, the paychecks smaller. Without solid financial backing or diversified revenue, his savings ran dry. Then came health problems. In 1993, at just 57 years old, David Houston died of a brain aneurysm. It was sudden, shocking, and deeply sad. But what made it worse was the revelation that, despite a Grammy and multiple chart toppers, he had left behind little money and almost no estate. His fame had been real, but fleeting. And in his final years, Houston was a man living modestly, just trying to hold on. Few tributes followed. There was no major televised memorial. No documentary. The man who once stood at the top of the charts was buried with barely a whisper from the industry he helped define. Today, Almost Persuaded still plays on classic country stations. But ask the average listener about David Houston's later life, and they'll probably draw a blank. That's the cruelty of forgotten fame. He gave everything to country music, and when the curtain fell, it gave him nothing in return. 7. Keith Whitley, a rising star cut down by his own darkness. Few voices in country music have ever sounded as haunting, honest, and pure as Keith Whitley's. With songs like Don't Close Your Eyes, When You Say Nothing at All, and I'm No Stranger to the Rain, he didn't just sing, he bled into every word. Many believed he was destined to be the next great icon of the genre, and maybe he would have been, if the bottle hadn't gotten to him first. Born in Kentucky, Whitley was a bluegrass prodigy, performing alongside Ralph Stanley by age 15. But as his solo career took off in the late 1980s, the pressure, the expectations, and his long-standing struggle with alcohol became impossible to manage. His rise was meteoric. His album Don't Close Your Eyes became a critical and commercial smash. Fans and fellow artists hailed him as the future of country. He married fellow country singer Lori Morgan. On the surface, things looked golden, But behind closed doors, Keith was spiraling. Despite attempts to get sober, he battled chronic alcoholism. The fame only amplified his isolation. He drank to escape the fear of failing and the fear of succeeding. On May 9, 1989, Keith Whitley was found dead in his Nashville home. The cause? Acute alcohol poisoning. He was just 34 years old. He left behind a wife, a young son, an unfinished album, and a career that was just beginning to take flight. His bank accounts, once full of promise, had been eroded by medical costs, bad contracts, and the unpredictability of a music career cut short. Despite his massive potential, Keith never got the chance to secure long-term financial stability. Royalties trickled in after his death, but not to him. He had no time to build generational wealth or plan for the future. What remained went to funeral expenses and legal tangles. His story is especially heartbreaking because he had everything: talent, support, love, and still couldn't outrun the darkness. Today, Keith Whitley is revered as a legend, a what could have been in the annals of country music. But it's important to remember, he died a young man, financially unstable, and emotionally worn down by a battle he never truly won. 8. Hawkshaw Hawkins, the gentle giant lost in the sky. Hawkshaw Hawkins stood tall, literally and musically. At 6'5", with a smooth baritone voice and magnetic stage presence, he was a Grand Ole Opry favorite and a rising star in the 1950s and early 60s. His signature hit, Lonesome 77203, was climbing the charts, and the future looked bright for this country gentleman from West Virginia. But fate had other plans. On March 5, 1963, Hawkshaw boarded a small plane with Patsy Cline and Cowboy Copas, returning from a benefit concert for the family of DJ Cactus Jack Call. The skies were dark and turbulent. Somewhere over Tennessee, the plane crashed into a wooded area. There were no survivors. The nation mourned the loss of Patsy Cline, but Hawkshaw Hawkins' story was overshadowed, almost forgotten in the tragedy. What many fans didn't know was that he died virtually broke. Despite being a regular on the Opry and having multiple hits under his belt, Hawkshaw had no financial safety net. Record deals in those days heavily favored the labels, not the artists. There were no hefty royalty checks, no merchandise deals, and no real artist protections. At the time of his death, he left behind a pregnant wife, country singer Jean Shepard, and 2 young children, with very little money in the bank. The home they lived in was modest, and the life insurance policies were minimal. Jean Shepard would later say that she struggled to make ends meet after his death, relying on her own rising career to carry the family forward. The country music world had moved on quickly, and Hawkshaw's catalog was left to gather dust. It took decades before Lonesome 77203 received the posthumous #1 spot it deserved, ironically reaching the top after he died. But by then, it was a hollow victory. The man who had sung of heartbreak died without fortune, without fanfare, and without the recognition he had earned. Hawkshaw Hawkins may have soared in life, but in death he vanished into the mist of forgotten stars, leaving behind a legacy built on talent, tragedy, and far too many what-ifs. 9. Spade Culie, from Western swing royalty to a prison cell. There was a time when Spade Culie was known as the king of Western swing. A gifted fiddler and bandleader, he combined country music with big band energy, creating a sound that packed dance halls across California and the Southwest. In the 1940s and early 50s, his band was one of the hottest tickets around. He even starred in Hollywood westerns and hosted his own television show, a true multimedia star before that was common. But Culie's fame came crashing down in the most shocking and irreversible way imaginable. Behind the polished smile and snappy suits was a man unraveling. Culie was jealous, paranoid, and increasingly violent, particularly toward his wife, Ella May. On April 3, 1961, the world of country music gasped when it was revealed that Spade Culie had brutally tortured and murdered his wife in front of their 14-year-old daughter. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. His wealth, gone. His property was seized. His musical legacy evaporated overnight. The man who once stood on Hollywood sets and sold out stadiums died as a disgraced inmate with nothing left but shame. But here's the even stranger part. In 1969, Culie was granted a temporary furlough to perform a benefit concert. The event was meant to help raise awareness for prison reform, and Culie was planning a comeback. But shortly after the performance, he collapsed backstage and died of a heart attack. There was no grand funeral, no legacy to protect. The industry had erased him completely, and no one rushed to claim his music or defend his memory. Though his early work helped shape the development of Western swing and country fusion, his horrific crime ensured that his name would be remembered for all the wrong reasons. No statues, no tributes, no royalties, just a footnote in the darkest pages of country music history. His was not just a story of poverty of wealth, but of a moral bankruptcy that destroyed everything he touched. 10. Stonewall Jackson, the forgotten honky-tonk hero. With a name straight out of Civil War history and a voice that could cut through jukebox static, Stonewall Jackson was a pillar of the Grand Ole Opry. From the late 1950s through the 1970s, he delivered hit after hit. Waterloo, Don't Be Angry, and BJ the DJ cemented him as one of the most consistent country hitmakers of his generation. And for decades, he was a regular at the Opry, standing shoulder to shoulder with the genre's biggest names. But by the 2000s, something had changed. Stonewall, now aging, found himself being pushed out, not by the fans, but by the very institution he had helped build. In 2006, in a rare and bold move, he sued the Grand Ole Opry for age discrimination, claiming he had been deliberately kept off the airwaves and out of key performance slots because of his age. He alleged that younger management viewed him as too old and irrelevant. The lawsuit made headlines and shocked the traditional country community. But what most people didn't realize was just how much Jackson's livelihood depended on those performances. Without regular Opry gigs, without consistent merchandise sales, and with radio barely touching his music, his income stream had withered. Despite decades of contributions, Stonewall Jackson was facing financial hardship in his twilight years. The case was eventually settled out of court, but the damage was done. His name faded further into the background. While he continued to perform occasionally, it was clear the industry had moved on and left one of its founding voices behind. When he died in December 2021 at the age of 89, tributes were quiet. Few mainstream outlets honored his passing. There was no major retrospective, no posthumous surge of interest in his work. He died with little public recognition, and financially, his estate was modest, reflecting decades of gradual neglect. Stonewall Jackson's story is particularly cruel because he never stopped believing in country music, even when country music stopped believing in him. He lived his final years not in luxury or reverence, but in the slow erosion of legacy, another victim of an industry that often forgets the very men who built it. 11. Tom T. Hall, the storyteller who ran out of words. Tom T. Hall was never flashy, but his words cut deeper than rhinestones or chart positions ever could. Known for masterful songs like Harper Valley PTA, That's How I Got to Memphis, and Old Dogs, Children, and Watermelon Wine, Hall earned the nickname The Storyteller for his plain-spoken, poetic take on life in the American South. His influence stretched far beyond country. Singer-songwriters from Chris Christopherson to Bob Dylan praised his lyrical genius. In the 1970s, he was everywhere. And yet, by the 1990s, Tom T. Hall had seemingly vanished. Part of it was by choice. He stepped away from performing, frustrated with the direction modern country music was taking. But part of it was the industry moving on. As hat acts and slick production took over the charts, there was less room for intimate stories and thoughtful songwriting. Hall's royalties slowed. His name faded from public view. He no longer headlined tours. And while he was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame in 2008, it came too late to revive a career that had quietly gone still. In his final years, Hall became increasingly reclusive. He rarely appeared in public. He no longer gave interviews. Despite his immense contributions to American songwriting, he lived in quiet isolation, and the money once earned from decades of work barely trickled in. The man who once painted rural America in lyrical gold was now largely forgotten by the industry he helped shape. On August 20th, 2021, Tom T. Hall died by suicide at the age of 85, a devastating revelation for those who grew up worshiping his gentle voice and introspective words. There were no lavish tributes, no Grammy specials, no resurgence of his music on the charts, just quiet headlines, and for many younger fans, a name they didn't even recognize. Hall once wrote, I love little baby ducks, old pickup trucks, slow-moving trains, and rain. But in the end, his greatest tragedy was that the music world he loved so deeply forgot how to love him back. He died in obscurity, with only a fraction of the recognition and the fortune that a man of his caliber deserved. 12. Billy Walker, the tall Texan who died broke on the road. Known as the Tall Texan, Billy Walker was a Grand Ole Opry mainstay and one of the genre's most dependable voices throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. With hits like Cross the Brazos at Waco, Charlie's Shoes, and A Million and One, Walker built a reputation as a solid performer, never flashy but always heartfelt. He toured relentlessly, helping to keep the traditional country sound alive as younger, more polished acts began to dominate. Yet, for all his fame and decades-long career, Billy Walker never achieved true financial security. Part of the reason was his personality, modest, trusting, and uninterested in the business side of the industry. He let others manage his bookings, contracts, and deals, often earning far less than he should have. And while he stayed active into his later years, the shows got smaller and the paychecks thinner. He invested little, saved even less, and, like many of his peers, relied on live shows to survive. On May 21, 2006, tragedy struck. Walker, his wife Betty, and two bandmates were killed in a car crash just outside Montgomery, Alabama. They were on the way home from a performance. At 77 years old, Billy Walker was still traveling by van, playing small-town gigs to make ends meet. After his death, it was revealed that Walker left behind no significant estate, no retirement fund, and no major royalty streams. The man who had graced the Grand Ole Opry stage for decades died with barely enough to cover funeral costs. There were kind words spoken, a few tribute performances, but no long-standing honors. His financial struggles had mirrored those of countless country artists who had come up in a time when record labels took everything and artists were expected to be grateful. Billy Walker's story is heartbreaking, not because he fell from grace, but because he was never truly lifted by it. He was loyal to country music until the end, but like too many before him, country music wasn't loyal back. 13. Jimmy Martin, the king of bluegrass, who never got his crown. To bluegrass fans, Jimmy Martin was a giant. With his razor-sharp voice, kinetic stage presence, and relentless drive, he helped define the very sound of bluegrass in the 1950s and 60s. As a former member of Bill Monroe's Bluegrass Boys and later the leader of his own Sunny Mountain Boys, Jimmy recorded classics like Sunny Side of the Mountain and Hit Parade of Love. But for all his achievements, Jimmy Martin never got the respect or the money he earned. His relationship with the Grand Ole Opry was strained and bitter. He appeared on the stage many times, but was never made an official member. The reason? His wild temper, heavy drinking, and unpredictable behavior. Behind the scenes, Martin was known to clash with producers, storm out of interviews, and burn bridges that others wouldn't dare touch. This defiance came at a price. He was blackballed by mainstream Nashville. Major labels kept their distance. And without widespread radio play or commercial marketing, Martin's income relied entirely on touring, small festival gigs, and selling records out of his car. He lived humbly, often on the road in a dilapidated motorhome. He resented the industry, but he also needed it. And when it didn't embrace him, he lashed out. In one interview near the end of his life, he said bitterly, "They gave everyone else a crown, but left me barefoot in the cold." When Jimmy Martin died of bladder cancer in 2005 at the age of 77, he had no major estate, no trust fund, and no industry-backed tribute. He was buried in a suit he had worn for decades, alongside a tombstone he had designed himself, declaring once and for all that he was the king of bluegrass. And yet, the Grand Ole Opry still never honored him as a member. Jimmy Martin died with a legacy but no wealth, with influence but no reward, with fire in his voice, and emptiness in his wallet. He sang with everything he had, but when the music stopped, Nashville had already stopped listening. 14. Larry John Wilson, the forgotten poet of Southern country soul. Larry John Wilson was never a household name, but to those who knew, he was a legend in hiding. Emerging in the 1970s with a deep, aching baritone and poetic songwriting that mixed country, soul, and Southern storytelling, Wilson released critically acclaimed albums like New Beginnings and Let Me Sing My Song to You. He was part of the illustrious Heart-Worn Highways documentary, where he stood among legends like Townes Van Zandt and Guy Clark, equal in talent and in some ways even more haunting in delivery. But Larry John didn't play the game. He shunned commercial trends. He refused to mold his sound to fit the radio. And as a result, the industry never knew what to do with him. His records were praised by critics, but poorly promoted. His live shows were deeply emotional, but often underattended. By the early 1980s, frustrated and broke, he walked away from music completely, disappearing into a world of odd jobs, debt, and disillusionment. For decades, he was missing from the scene, until the mid-2000s, when a small European label convinced him to return to the studio. He released a self-titled comeback album in 2008 to rave reviews, but it was too late. He was living in near poverty. He had no real estate, no royalties to lean on, and no medical insurance. He traveled sparsely, performing small gigs for modest fees. Despite a brief reappraisal of his genius, he died in 2010 at age 69, with little more than a few battered guitars and a handful of loyal fans to his name. There was no national outcry, no CMA tribute, just a few online forums mourning a man who, in another world, might have been the voice of a generation. Larry John Wilson gave his heart to the music, and in return, the industry looked the other way. He didn't just die in poverty, he died largely in silence. And that may be the most painful lyric he ever wrote, though it never made it into a song. 15. Hank Williams, the king who died in the backseat, broken alone. Even if you've never listened to a full country album in your life, you know the name Hank Williams. He wasn't just a star, he was the blueprint. With immortal songs like I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry, You're Cheatin' F Heart, and Hey Good Lookin', Hank practically wrote the dictionary on heartache and twang. By age 25, he was a national sensation. By age 29, he was dead. But what most people don't realize is that when Hank Williams died on January 1st, 1953, in the backseat of a Cadillac en route to a show in Canton, Ohio, he was penniless, addicted, and utterly alone. Despite the fame, Hank's life was a storm of pain. He battled spina bifida occulta, a painful spinal condition that led to lifelong reliance on morphine and alcohol. His substance abuse spiraled. He missed shows, lost contracts, and was ultimately fired from the Grand Ole Opry, the very institution he helped bring into the mainstream. By late 1952, Hank was performing sporadically in dives and school auditoriums for cash. His health was in shambles. His relationships had collapsed, and his financial state was a disaster. Most of his early royalties had gone to others, managers, labels, and hangers-on. He had no trust fund, no savings, no fallback plan. At just 29 years old, he died of heart failure exacerbated by drugs and alcohol, slumped in the back seat next to an oblivious driver who thought he was sleeping. When the world learned that the voice of a generation had died on the road, between gigs, without even enough cash to pay his funeral expenses, it sent shockwaves. The man who had written, "I'll never get out of this world alive," had, heartbreakingly, told his own future. His son, Hank Williams Jr., would go on to carry the name forward, but nothing could erase the sorrow of how the original Hank was treated. He gave country music its bones, its blood, its soul, and in return he died young, broke and burdened by pain. This isn't just a sad ending, it's a warning, a tragedy, a loss that still haunts country music to this day. The saddest song Hank ever sang was the one the world never heard, the silence after his voice was gone.